Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Well, welcome to this podcast review for July 2nd, 2023. And I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Thanks for joining us this week, everybody. Brendan, do you think we were friends in a past life?
I think we are friends 8,000 times removed all of our past lives, according to, what's it called, Inyan, as they call it in this movie? Yeah, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I don't want to sound disrespectful, but I mean, JD, for a little context for all of our listeners, when we always talk about the day that we met in Lexington, Kentucky, the connection that we made, I think it suggests that we knew each other beforehand in some capacity, right? I think that's safe to assume.
You know, it's really quite something to think about. And I know it sounds hyperbolic, but the chemistry that Brendan and I have today was pretty immediate, even on that first time that we met. Like, this is how we talk to each other. So
shout out to West 6 Brewing in Lexington, Kentucky. We got to talking about movies. We had a mutual friend that introduced us, and I think the movie that locked in that compatibility was Spider-Man 2 of all movies. I think that was the one that was like, okay, this guy's worth talking to a bit more.
It was an incredible conversation. It was a lot of fun. It really did not take long for us to connect. And
it was almost 10 years ago when you think about it.
You came on Extra Film in 2014.
Yeah.
So, we're close to that 10-year mark.
Yeah. Your good friend, Nate Parsons, was there, old co-host of the show.
Yeah.
So I met him that same night too. Man, it was like a historical moment. For those of our fans listening, I bet you're jealous. You didn't get a chance to be part of that.
I know. Pretty incredible. And I wonder what our podcast sounded like the other 8,000 times that we've done this.
Oh gosh, yeah. Especially if this existed back in medieval times. What were we doing? Like, were we doing reviews of Shakespeare's plays or something?
Yeah, of course. That's exactly how it worked. At any rate,
I've heard a couple people call Past Lives a multiverse movie of sorts. So I guess, hypothetical. So I guess it only makes sense that we're talking about it in this way, or at least introducing it in this way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm very excited and a little nervous to get into this film because the hype surrounding it has been astronomical. It's been incredible.
What does it have on Metacritic now? I think it has a solid 94% on Metacritic.
3,000%.
8,000%.
8,000%.
8,000 past lives out of 100.
All I've heard is nothing but universal praise for this film. So no pressure to us, and we'll certainly do our best to get into it. It is directed by Celine Song, her debut film here.
Yeah, we have to emphasize that. It's her first feature film.
Yeah, pretty wild, starring Greta Lee, Teo Yu, John Magaro in this.
Yeah.
This film is about Nora and Haesung, two deeply connected childhood friends. They are wrestled apart after Nora's family immigrates from South Korea. 20 years later, they are reunited for one fateful week as they confront notions of love and destiny. All right, Brendan, let's jump into this one. Past lives. What do you think?
No pressure, right? No, it honestly, it really sucks going into these movies when the hype already exists like this, right? Because this is something we do. It's kind of a side occupation for us. We consider ourselves critics, but we don't always get to see these movies in advance because we don't go to every festival.
I got two kids.
You've got two kids. But we do, keep a close ear to the buzz around festival movies, right? And if I'm not mistaken, this premiered at Sundance, and the hype was immense. I've heard a lot of people say, such as our friend Brian Rowe, for instance, who talked about on his video review of the film, that even going into the movie, before he got a chance to see it, the audience just exuberated this energy that seemed to suggest they were in for something special, even
Yeah.
before they knew that what they were potentially in for.
Sure.
Like the movie created such hype, and then it apparently lived up to the hype, and now we have to go into this movie with the knowledge of that hype. It's such a terrible trap.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah, thankfully the movie's great. So it's
all that to say.
All that to say, the movie's great. Yeah, it's really good. It's astounding that this is a directorial debut because there's such confidence in what Celine Song is telling here. It's one of those movies that it could have easily fallen into manipulative trappings, especially with regard to the type of movie that it is. And there have been a lot of comparisons made to movies such as the Before trilogy, Richard Linklater's Before trilogy, which I think is somewhat apt. They're tonally so different that I don't really feel like we should be making that comparison, honestly. But
yeah, that's fair.
They're romantic conversational films, so superficially they are kind of comparable in that way. I think it has more in common with something like David Lean's Brief Encounter. It just happens to take place over a much longer stretch of time. It is not a brief picture. It's more like elongated encounter in some
exactly.
ways.
Decades encounter.
Yeah, but we'll talk about that because I think the film's framing device is really interesting. And I think that's why the film really works so well, because it plays with the passage of time as if it is a character in the movie. And that's something we all tend to think about, especially for those of us who are the same age, or at least roughly the same age as the film's central protagonist, right? So it's a very like vulnerable time in our lives when we think about those connections that we don't have anymore and how special they may have been, and whether there is validity in the fact that there was a connection with them in prior lifetimes, if that is something we choose to believe in, whether our culture dictates that or not. So I think the film is really good, despite being very culturally specific. You know, it is about two Korean people. It still somehow allows us to take part in the conversation and feel the same things. It creates a universality to it, which I think is the best thing for any movie like this. It's relatable. It really is. And I do think it ends up being a very beautiful film in that regard. We might talk about this more when we get to, what is it, episode 541, when we do our mid-year report, talking about some of the best films of the year thus far. I think all of our colleagues have this at a number one, solidly speaking. And I don't know if I'm going to say that yet, but to say it's one of the best films of the year thus far, I think is kind of a given. It really is a great film.
Oh, yeah. Past Lives, I agree with you. All of the pretext is hilarious because it comes with all of the aforementioned hype, but I am lockstep with you in the sense that this is an excellent, excellent debut film. Easily one of the best movies of the year. Will be represented on episode 541 in some way, shape, or form. However, to take it a step further, not only is it great, this is a film after my own heart.
I was going to say, it's kind of a JD movie.
It is such a JD movie because at its core, it is this bitingly poignant film about heartache and time and longing, which on its own terms, that is very moving here. However, and this is the kicker for me, how those things are tethered to childhood friendship and closure.
Did we just decipher a new T-shirt to put on TeePublic for us?
Maybe. Yeah, childhood and closure. Oh my gosh. The JD special.
JD special. The double skis.
Yeah. Two of my favorite things, and those ideas here are just heavenly. I love when films depict childhood, and especially when it tackles closure.
Yeah.
That's all great. But kidding aside, so much of this film is really about childhood friendship and love and this gaping hole that forms when that is suddenly ripped away, specifically in this case when Nora and her family moved to Canada when she was an adolescent. And that's the interesting thing about longing and connection. Sometimes it's out of our control.
Yeah.
Nora had no say in her parents' decision to leave Korea. But sometimes it's also the choices we make, because later on in the film, after they do reconnect via Skype after a decade apart, we see them reform that childhood bond.
Yeah.
And we start to get a sense that there's something bubbling underneath the surface for both of them, only for Nora to have the realization that their lives aren't a fantasy, that there's no practical way for them to be together. So
Yeah.
she makes this choice. And I do love the film's self-awareness and commitment to realism and all of that, as much as we all yearn for lavishing romance and stories that feel like fairy tales.
Yeah.
The truth is that our practical lives don't always play out that way, and this film is wholly dedicated to that idea. But that's what makes its ideas on closure so compelling and vital to how this story plays out. That final scene, what it says about closure, that incredible edit reflecting on childhood, the elegant stoicism of the moment, it is utter perfection. So much heartbreak to be had in this film, but it's tender, it's soulful, it's mature, and truly it I think echoes one of the best films of the year, and I loved pretty much everything about it.
Yeah, I want to briefly talk about the final scene there, because you were just alluding to it, and we won't give it away, obviously, but it's really the one moment that I feel like is the most literal at depicting some type of emotional release, right? But even so, there is still a little bit of ambiguity as to what that closure means, if it's filled with, you know, a sense of regret or like a sense of fulfillment, like a question has been answered, that you can move on from something now. I do feel a certain way about it, as if like I do think Celine Song leans more heavily into one extreme there over the other, but I still think there is some lingering ambiguity as to whether how that character internalizes that closure, right? Which I think is one of the film's biggest strengths, right? And that's also foreshadowed by a specific moment in that final scene that just lingers on two characters doing nothing. I'll simply say, and it creates this tension that I was on the edge of my seat more so than I think any horror film I think I've seen over the past year, because I had no idea what was going to happen.
For sure.
And I think the film is playing with that sense of what if very literally, and also kind of, you know, playing with it in a meta way about what these quote unquote what if movies do and what they're ultimately about. And you know me, Jiggy, I'm a sucker for those. I'm a sucker for a good what if movie, especially if it's in the romantic setting. But I think this one really does at the very least, a very interesting job tackling that and making us question where a character ends up after that closure is internalized. I think it's really great.
Oh, I completely agree. And I think it's interesting to talk about both of their reactions to that final moment. Now, obviously, I don't want to get into any spoilers here, so I'll be vague, but the final shot of this film, I'll say, again, vaguely, revolves around Nora.
Yeah.
And her reaction to this closure.
Yeah.
And what she is reverberating there, I think, is utterly fascinating given the context of the setting.
Yeah.
And another character that is involved there. And what it says about potential regret or simple heartache over what could have been if her family didn't move, as you're talking about there. And the fact that her reaction is overt in when you consider the context, it makes that moment all the more nuanced and captivating, right?
Yeah.
And I mentioned that there's a third character involved in that final shot.
Yeah.
The film doesn't really get into it, but it's interesting to see the reaction of that character as well.
I have a lot to say about that character as we continue with this conversation.
Yeah, because I think there's a lot to consider about how he felt given that overt reaction.
Yeah.
And the ambiguity there, I think, is absolutely stirring.
Yeah.
It's so incredible. And I think the irony of it, when you flip that over to Hai Song, his reaction to the moment is much more internalized.
Yeah.
It's less overt, but still we know exactly what he's feeling. Like, we know where this ends for him.
Yeah.
And I love that irony. Like, the way Celine Song is able to, in the best ways, I don't say this as a bad thing, but to manipulate emotion using subtlety and the lack thereof
Yeah.
with these two characters, I just find utterly, utterly compelling here.
Yeah, I agree. And I like the way that she plays with, the movie tropes of a story like this, right? Because the way that this film crystallizes, in many ways, we don't really know where these characters are going to end up exactly. We just know that this one brief moment of closure is what was necessary to get them to a next point, right? But I mean, some people might argue that the final minutes here are a happy ending. Some might argue that it's anything but that. And I think you can kind of pull it in
It's
both
a little bit of
directions.
both. Yeah.
It is both simultaneously. Maybe the argument is it leaning more one way over the other? And I think that feeling you have about the ending will evolve as you experience new things. Being like the royal you, not you in particular, JD, but just like you as a general audience member. Audiences will react differently depending on where they are in their respective stages in life. Kind of like, okay, going back to the Before trilogy, right? I like Before Sunrise when I was a lot younger, but now I like Before Sunset a lot more now that I'm in my 30s, because there's more to take away from that dynamic now. And I feel like the ending of Past Lives is doing all of that in a mere matter of seconds.
It really is.
It really is. But I think it just goes to show how confident and how assured this directorial debut is, that I'm just shocked it's a directorial debut. I honestly cannot believe that. It's just,
it is
so well realized in that regard.
Well, and I think what's really great, perhaps why I think the film is able to have its cake and eat it too, circles back to what I noted in my opening thoughts as it relates to its self-awareness and commitment to realism.
Yeah.
Because there are conversations that are had here. I can think of a few moments. One is the significant moment as Nora and Hai Song they're having these Skype exchanges, and she comes to an epiphany where she realizes that she can't just keep pursuing this, because where is all of this going? What is the end here?
Yeah.
And so she brings up a crossroads that is heartbreaking but pragmatic.
Yeah.
And the practical choice that she makes there is very understandable. There's also a moment later on in the film where she brings up the idea that, and for some context, her character here of Nora is a screenwriter or a stage writer.
A playwright. Yeah.
A playwright. So the self-awareness of her life as a playwright, as someone who writes stories for a living, that if she was writing this out into a stage play, the ultimate conclusion here in terms of audience pandering would be that she gets together with her childhood crush. That's what audiences want to see, right?
They talk about that literally. There's one.
Yes, that's it. That's the moment I'm talking about. She brings this up very literally, and they have a conversation about it.
Yeah. Well, it's not even just her. Her husband also brings it up later on too, and openly states that if this were one of those stories, I would be the white male villain in this situation. Okay, is that a bit on the nose? Yeah, sure. It is, but I don't know. There's something about the way John Magaro
and he's so good here.
Gosh, yeah. We'll talk about him a lot, I think, as this conversation keeps going. He is phenomenal in this movie. But it is, that character, at least, of Arthur, is a deconstruction of that typical character trope in a story like this. So while there is like a literal sense and a very directness to that line of dialogue that he speaks to, he sells it in a way that's almost kind of humorous, that it adds like this almost like meta form of comedy to the film that I really did appreciate. It really added some levity, a little lightheartedness to the film, and I think it really works in that regard.
Well, and I also think, and I think this is where the film gets to have its cake and eat it too, by writing Nora as a playwright and Arthur as well, because he is in the same industry. He's also
a novelist.
writer. That's how they met. You have to, the film has to be direct with this. Yeah. Otherwise, they lose credence as writers.
It kind of that's kind of how they speak, right? I mean, like those who create art sometimes have to internalize their art literally and verbally in order to come to what kind of conclusion they need to decipher from that. So, I mean, it makes sense in the moment. It seems organic. That's the whole point.
Yeah, it seems organic, and that's a credit to Celine Song and her writing and the performances and how they make it authentic and genuine in the context of this relationship and the specific drama that we see here. But if the film is going to commit to pragmatism and reality, these are writers who would understand the nuances of this situation. Yeah. And if I was writing out this story, if my life was going to be turned into a movie, of course this would be something that would be brought up. So for them as writers, as professionals, to understand and have self-awareness that this is a unique situation, a little bit awkward, and yes, if we were Hollywoodizing this, that he would be the evil white guy and these would be the two that would get together at the end of the film. That's how this would go, and they, as professional writers, would have an understanding of this. So for the film to ignore that, I think would be a disservice to the movie.
Oh, absolutely. And they go out of their way to try and ignore those tropes, even mid-conversation, too. Like, they're very much aware of that. Yeah. And a lot of it works because of how good of a performative piece that this is. We mentioned John Magaro. He is so good in this. I mean, like I can't help but feel like what kind of awkward situation he has been put into this, like as a literal third wheel in this kind of experience as Nora's husband at this point. I mean, you do feel very bad for the guy, yet at the same time, you as an audience member, you recognize that Nora needs to pursue this. She needs to do this, and you still want her to. So it's not like you're rooting for someone over something else. It doesn't work that way. You just want everyone to come to their own conclusions that they need to come to by experiencing whatever the heck this is. And I love that.
Oh, I completely agree. I think the film threads this needle perfectly of Arthur having understanding and empathy for his wife.
Yeah.
But also having conversation, not afraid to necessarily he's not creating conflict, but he's not letting this bubble under the surface.
Right.
And they have conversations about it, but
he's not shoving it under the rug either. He's allowing it to still be part of their dynamic as it needs to be.
Yeah, and showing empathy the entire way. I mean, that's what I think makes Arthur so fascinating here, is that at times you do sense that he is awkward, that
a little uneasy about it. Yeah.
He's a little uneasy, but he understands the importance of this for Nora, and eventually he also understands the importance of this for Hae-sung as well. Yeah. That conversation they have at the bar or at the restaurant when it's just the two of them.
Yeah, it's
and
great.
He treats him with nothing but respect and kindness. He even says to him directly something to the effect of, "You made the right decision to come here."
Yeah, I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad to have met
you're
you.
Here. Yeah. And that, to me, I think is utterly fascinating for a character in that position. And also from Hae-sung's point of view as well, you think about how uneasy it is for him. Not only is the situation a little bit awkward, but now he's in a foreign country where he doesn't speak much English.
Yeah.
So he's going to feel a little vulnerable, a little bit isolated. And for Arthur to respond that way, imagine if it was the other way around.
Oh yeah.
Imagine if Arthur was like, "No, I'm not having any of this."
This could have easily gone the route of something like The Heartbreak Kid or something like that,
Yeah.
right? And then this dynamic between Nora and Hai Sung would then be meant to suggest something like, I don't know, that Nora was falling out of love with Arthur or something, her husband, right? But that's not the case. Like even
Yeah.
as this dynamic between Nora and Hai Sung is, recontextualized when they reconvene, they get to know each other again after 12 years. You still always get a sense that Nora still has this genuine love for her husband, Arthur.
Yes,
that
that's
never
important.
that
Yeah.
never goes away. That is always there.
Yeah.
And that just overcomplicates the issue even more, which is real. That's what happens.
Yeah.
That's what happens in situations like this.
Yeah, and I think that's what I really love about Greta Lee's performance as well too, because
So good.
she does such a great job of early on committing to this curiosity she has for
Yeah.
Hai Sung, and this idea that there could be something there, but what is the cost of this? Is this a real thing? Like the way she grapples with that, I think is really, really fantastic.
Yep.
And then everything she had, like her dynamic with Magaro is really great. And even when Arthur is, echoing a little bit of insecurity, I don't know if I deserve you, or he feels out of his element. Like she does such a great job of reverberating that love right back to him, that this isn't about me trying to get back with a childhood sweetheart as much as it is her finding closure. And I think she does such a great job of making that clear, that Arthur's only response to it can't be jealousy or to create conflict. It's
That just gets in the
a
way
matter
of
of
it.
understanding. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that we're spending so much time talking about the effectiveness of this movie, at least in this way. We're really just talking about the final third of the movie in many ways, because that's something we also have to address is the narrative framing device here, right? Which is, I think, pitch perfect in trying to, showcase the passage of time and make it feel effective, make it feel like that's what's actually happening. The film is told in 3 acts, and each act is separated by a 12-year gap. So we start with them at age 12, I think, or at least age 10, 11, 12, somewhere around that range.
Yeah.
And then we meet them 12 years later in their 20s, and the entire time is a Skyping session between them.
Yeah.
I just I feel like I'm veering a little off topic here because I want to address something I love about this movie. It's the way that Skype and technology itself plays a part here. It's almost like its own character, and it creates a hindrance, which again is validated by Nora's choice to move on from that because it has become a distraction in the trajectory of her life and where she wants to go. But the use of technology and the fact that Skype calls sometimes freeze or fail, it's part of it. It sort of reminded me of you remember the movie Personal Shopper, the Olivier Assayas
Oh
film?
yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
for
I was
sure.
thinking of the ellipses, of the text ellipses,
Yeah.
and you're waiting for something to
Yep.
happen. It's like the use of technology as a character in that second act in particular. I think you always feel that in some way. Like there are little details that play a part in the dynamic between Hai Sung and Nora that become this hindrance of sorts that keep that distance kind of spread thin, that keep the passage of time rolling as long as they do. It's little details that I think really play a part in the story. I think are really effective here.
I completely agree. I think what's interesting about the use of technology, in addition to what you're saying there, because I do agree with what you're alluding to, but it's also how their lives revolve around this technology. It's Nora waking up at 7 o'clock in the morning because that's the only time she can have a conversation, or Hai Sung eating lunch with his coworkers and then abruptly leaving because he's getting a call. Like their lives are completely disrupted, or they're scheduled around these phone calls.
And how about that great use of this great directorial touch from Celine Song to emulate that literal distance between them, the sense of place of it all. We cut to, I guess it looks like the Korean skyline of Seoul, right? In the daylight, and then instantly it cuts to Manhattan and it's midnight.
Yeah.
There's no break between it. And again, that just proves that point even further, that there are even some filmmaking tactics here that play a part in that, outside of just the narrative pieces that are feeding into it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's also that moment where, and this was early on, maybe this was the first or second time they had a conversation, but they're talking and Nora says something about like, I haven't had dinner yet. I have to go eat. And he's like, you haven't had dinner yet? What time is it there? Oh, it's
midnight. Yeah.
Midnight. Or whatever.
Yeah.
So like, that's just another one of those cues that, depicts the distance between the two of them. Mm-hmm. But it is fascinating to see like how that technology evolves as the relationship does, because you think of Hae-sung and him on the phone going up that, that little skywriter thing.
Yeah.
And he's showing her the city landscape as they're going up.
And it just freezes.
It just freezes. But like, it is the technology that is invading their lives as they are almost addicted to these phone calls, and they're always looking forward to it. And eventually it gets to that, I was going to say breaking point. I don't know if that might be a little bit too harsh, but like these crossroads where Nora again understands that my whole life is revolving around this. I am anxious. I'm looking up flights to Korea, she says.
Yeah.
And it's taking over my life. Like, where is this going? So it is really fascinating to see how technology is a part of it, how their choices, how their lives become so entangled in all of this, that, from a writing standpoint, from a direction standpoint, from a performance standpoint, there's such an elegant symmetry to invoking this bubbling that is happening between both characters.
And it's not just about them in particular, right? It's not just about their relationship with each other. It's the reminder of what their pasts are, right? Like think of it this way. Like, you and I have both lived out of the states that we've grown up in, right? Like, we both lived in Kentucky. We moved around quite a bit. You live in Florida now. I'm back in Pennsylvania. But how many times have you gone back to visit either family or a friend, and all of a sudden you just realize, I want to stay here longer. Like, I don't want to go back to where I currently live outside of this. So this relationship between Hae-sung and Nora, at least from Nora's perspective, it's pulling her back to her Korean life when she immigrated out of there for a reason. There was a new trajectory she wanted to follow. She's chasing something else. She's in New York City now for that reason. And she sees this as potentially, I guess, backpedaling in some ways. Maybe that could be the right word to use for her.
To goals.
Yeah, exactly. But I feel like we've all felt that in some way. It's the power of nostalgia, and we sometimes feel that power from the places themselves. The places we grew up, the places that were familiar to us when we were kids, because it was innocent and it was simple. And there was a loveliness to that. And I feel like that's also happening too. It's not just about these two people. There's more to it for what these two people represent then.
Oh, I completely agree. I think a sense of place is a big part of it.
Yeah.
And the other major consideration is childhood.
Yeah.
It's their friendship.
Yeah.
It's how close they were when they were young. Like, they spent all their time together. They were, pseudo boyfriend, girlfriend, at least for what you could be at that age. They did go on a literal date that we see early on.
It almost felt like an arranged marriage waiting to happen at age 12.
Kind of did, but they truly cared about each other a lot. And I think what really carries over, oftentimes we talk about this with other films, most of the time we're talking about characters, like these characters that have like these ghostly presence in these films, even when they're not on screen, you feel them.
Yeah.
In this case, it's not so much a person as much as it is a lack of closure.
Yep.
Because that last moment between the two of them, is a little anticlimactic.
It's a
right?
it's a Thanos snap. It's basically what it is.
a little bit where
Yeah.
there's a simple goodbye, but that's all that it is. And for friends that were really close, that leaned on each other as heavily as they did, there's a missing gap there because they didn't really get the closure that they were looking for, which is what makes the reconnection all those years later, it's what makes it so engrossing and ravishing, especially when they start to consider if there's something beyond just a normal Skype friendship that they could have.
Yeah.
And that lack of closure becomes all the more vivid for them when another 12 years goes by and there's still something that's lingering there to the point where Haesung is like, okay, now's my time. I'm going to New York.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in pursuit of anything romantically,
No.
but just to find that closure, just to be able to look at my friend in the eye and say that I missed you deeply, and I just wanted to have one last moment together.
It makes it even more interesting knowing that while 12 years have passed since they last talked, that whole session in the middle segment of the movie was a digital reconnecting, right? So in actuality, they haven't seen each other for 24 years, which adds even more intrigue and power to that reconciliation in the third act. It's really interesting, and it made me start thinking about situations in my childhood that could be similar, not necessarily in a romantic way, but I think of just like close male friends I had that I was really close with that maybe, let's say, moved away when I was 14 or something like that. And I can recall having similar goodbyes with them because as children, you don't really want to dwell in that kind of confrontation, that kind of realness, right? It's easy to tell like some of your other relatively close friends that, oh, I'm moving, I'm leaving. Yeah, it's fun and stuff. But your closest friends, the ones that matter most to you, you sometimes end up having that awkward goodbye to because you just don't know how to have that real conversation with them. Which is what makes their goodbye in the first act so relatable because I've been there in some ways. I'm sure many kids have because it's just the way that they react to that realness.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you make a great point that when you're that young, you don't really understand the gravity of what that's going to feel like.
Yeah,
so,
it doesn't make you feel good, but you can't really comprehend it well yet.
No, absolutely not, which is why that simple goodbye at the end of the first act isn't enough, and it lingers, especially when, in this context, it's not just that they were childhood friends passively. Like they were deeply connected.
Yeah.
They were extremely close. A simple goodbye is just not enough. And it's interesting, the passing of time, because you're right. There's a fascinating irony here, I guess. And I think this, thematically speaking, it certainly says something about closure and the heftiness of it.
Yeah.
When 2/3 of their lives, they haven't seen each other. They have not physically been around each other for 2/3 of their lives. Now, there was a phase in the middle where they talked to each other on Skype, as we talked about. However, they physically had not been together for 2/3 of their lives to that point.
Yeah.
That's a long time to not be with someone and yet still yearn for them deeply.
Yeah.
And to me, that says something about childhood and the connections we can make when we're children and the importance of closure.
Man, I just want to see a version of this movie, but in the world of Pixar's Luca now. But in some ways, it's kind of getting into something similar. The friendship that's depicted in Luca, whether you want to see that film as romantic or not is kind of beside the point, but there is a genuine connection between the two of them in a similar way that just speaks to the love you have for your childhood friends that we sometimes don't really acknowledge all that much. It's not that it's a closer bond. It's just a very different bond. It's a very particular bond that you have there, because it's built on innocence and it's not surrounded by the realness that adults have to go through. And that's what makes it so devastating when they are forced to say goodbye, because the real world is what interferes with that. And they can't comprehend it in the way that adults probably could.
The other thing to consider in all of this, while we've been talking about all these various threads and ideas, the one thing that we haven't really mentioned yet, and it is a big part of all of this as well.
Yeah.
And you'll have to forgive me. I don't know where you stand, Brendan. You might be in the same camp as me, so you might just have to forgive us both. But the Korean culture is a big part of this as well, particularly the idea of Inya.
I think it's called Inyan.
Inyan?
Yeah.
Okay.
So again, listeners, correct us if we're wrong here. But that's what I recall Nora talking about at the midpoint of the movie, and how there's at least like 8,000 connections you have between those individuals in past lives, that a simple brush on the shoulder between the two means that there was always some connection between the two in many lives leading up to that. I mean, again, this is a very superficial explanation. The movie goes into it more deeply, but that's, I guess, more or less the gist of it.
Yeah. And that is a big part of it as well, because we're here talking about closure and childhood and longing and connection, and all of that is certainly at play in this movie, for sure. Those broad appeals will be something that everyone can relate with, regardless of your background, whatever culture you come from. However, that idea within Korean culture is a big part of this as well. And you're right, they do speak to this a couple of times. However, I will say what's also fascinating about it is that you could argue that it's a driving force among Nora and Hae Sung, and why they're so deeply connected and why they need this closure. Because it relates back to their Korean heritage as well, and that specific idea. However, at one point, Nora also mentions to Arthur that it's nonsense, and they just say it to each other so they can find someone to sleep with, or forget the phrase that she used.
I thought about that too, and I think where the film concludes, I kind of came to the realization that she doesn't really believe that. I think it's just it's really just more of an in the moment kind of reaction.
Seduce is the word I was trying to think of. She says to Arthur, they use it to seduce someone else.
Well, I think it was more of a way of saying, this is an invitation for you to kiss me. You know, like I'm giving you the in right now. But I think in a literal sense, I don't necessarily think Nora believes that it's bullcrap. Right? I think it is something that their culture genuinely, I think, holds on to, at least given the dynamic between Nora and Hae Sung later on. I think there is a potential belief in that concept. But I know it adds, nuance to it, though, to hear different perspectives of it at different points in their lives.
Well, Hae Sung certainly has a stronghold with that idea, because he brings it up a couple of times, even in that third act. He asked Nora a couple of times, like, what do you think our past lives were like? Were we together? Were we married in past lives? Like, he keeps asking these questions. Like, he's accepted that in this life, in his reality, they won't be together. But there's a lingering curiosity that in their past lives, maybe it was different. And for whatever reason, it just didn't work out in this one. So he for sure has a stronghold in terms of like his yearning for that idea. And perhaps part of that yearning comes from the reality that what he wants, he won't be able to get. And that just elevates that yearning all the more. I don't know, but there's certainly an argument to be made there. But it is interesting with Nora how when she brings that up to Arthur, she's mostly using it as a seductive trait herself.
Well, and she's also, it's away from her cultural upbringing now.
That's true.
In many ways, like while I say that I don't necessarily think she believes it in that moment, it's possible that maybe she's trying to believe it in that moment, because maybe she sees that as part of her, part of her new trajectory here in the United States, right? Trying to veer away from that culture to try and develop a new trajectory for her. I mean, I don't know. All this stuff is more, speculation, but I think the film and Celine Song's screenplay, especially, I think they're allowing these conversations to be had about what portions of your childhood and your upbringing and your cultural beliefs at that point you still choose to hold on to, as far as which ones you want to let go of, and how that ties into other people that you had close relationships with in that childhood. And that's a lot. In a lot of ways, this is a movie about resurfacing those beliefs and those situations when you may have bottled them up for a while. It's in something that we can all relate to, I think.
Well, absolutely, because Nora certainly does wrestle with her Korean heritage at times. I mean, it's part of the conversations that she has with Arthur. She mentions with her mom at one point that she only speaks Korean with her mom and with Hae Sung, and that's it. And she speaks English the rest of the time.
Yeah.
So like this is something that goes back and forth. And so perhaps initially it's a way for her to connect with Arthur, to bring some of that in and for her to kind of tiptoe that line a little bit.
Sure.
And maybe there is a part of it where initially it's just, she's just playing into the seduction factor. Hey, this is something we do over in Korea. I'm going to do this right now as well.
Yeah.
And it is playful and it's funny. But then as the film unfolds, especially with Hae Sung and the conversations they have, then like that idea becomes all the more real to her, especially given those final moments.
It becomes believable to her again, thinking that maybe there is validity in this. And I like that the film also addresses that if there were past lives that they encountered each other in, they all could have still ended up rather differently, right? Doesn't mean they all have to end up the same. And there's still that lingering question, which I think is really interesting as well.
Absolutely. I wanted to also mention this as well. It's interesting, the emotional evolution of this film, because, I've seen a lot of people talk about how they walked out of the theater and were completely destroyed by this. I wasn't overtly moved by this film in the theater, like I have been with so many other movies.
Oh yeah,
which is a little awkward. I certainly felt the heartbreak though, like that final scene. As I talked about, I think is really great, and I think about how over the course of like really at the end of all three acts, Hae Sung is like he's left in the same position all three times, which I don't think, which I don't think is an accident.
No,
and it's interesting how Celine Song, how she emphasizes that all three times when he's a child. The end of the Skype conversation, he's perhaps a little bit more distressed and upset than he is heartbroken. Although you certainly see it on his face. It is so vivid, so lucid. And the third time we see it, there's an acceptance, there's a tenderness to it, but he's still so heartbroken. And there's something about the subtlety of it. And you know how I am with internalized performances. I love it so much more than your loud bombastic performances. Although it depends on the film, depends on the performance. I'm looking forward to Barbie. It's going to be awesome.
Yep. Very different kind of performance. I mean, oh yeah, this movie's terrible. I wanted to see a Ryan Gosling Ken performance somewhere in here. What it needed. That's what it needed. Yeah. That's what Hae Sung needed to do.
And look, I love a loud Ryan Gosling. Don't get me wrong. Like First Man is forever my.
But you'll take the First Man's over anything. Like only over the Only God Forgives Gosling, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Although he might be the only good thing about that movie. At any rate.
Okay.
I say that to say this. Greta Lee, what she's asked to do in that final scene is great. It is very, very good. It's striking for all the reasons we talked about earlier. But the internalized acceptance yet tender heartache that he reverberates, that Teo Yu reverberates in those final moments, is sublime. It's so good. And I mentioned my theater experience to say this. I didn't really, I didn't walk out crying. However, when I was thinking about this sometime later and I had written my notes and I was listening to the score for this on Spotify, which we need to talk about.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
That's honestly where I started to get emotional, was just thinking about the time that he had spent thinking on this and how it just is so deeply involved to his 12-year-old self. Like when he's standing there on the street in New York City, with this moment of closure, this moment of acceptance, it is him kind of tapping into this 12-year-old boy on the street in Korea. And of course the editing there, I don't necessarily want to reveal what takes place there, but there's an edit there that very much gets into this in a more overt way or more direct way, which I loved. I loved that edit. It's very, like, I thought about that, a little bit of that edit in Star is Born. That final number there. It's a little reminiscent.
It's a little louder of an edit there. Certainly going for something more emotionally grand.
Spiritually, it's along the same thing.
Tactically, it is more or less doing the same thing. Yeah.
Yes, but here, way more quieter, because it is all about stoicism in that moment. It's all about, again, that reverberating that internal emotion that I think is so striking here. And thinking about that over the course of the last few days, since I've seen this, that to me is where the emotion has come. Because because earlier you were talking about how, like, we can all kind of relate to this in some way with our friends or, whatever the case may be. But like over time, like being away from someone that you care about for years and years, sometimes a decade, in the case of this film, a couple of decades. And in the moment that you get that closure, like there's something about that emotional impact that just, it can carry a weight, but also lift a weight from you at the same time. And I think that's what's happening simultaneously with Hai Song.
Well,
and
yeah,
it's absolutely striking.
And Teo Yu, I believe that's how you pronounce his name. His performance there, I think, is wonderful.
So good.
The best line of dialogue in the entire movie, if you ask me, is probably the final line, which might be a bit of an easy one to say is the best line of dialogue, but I think his final line is a perfect summation in how you want to crystallize that dynamic. It's almost dreamlike, given what they're talking about and stuff. There's a dreamy haziness to it, not in a visual or aesthetic way, just in an emotional way that kind of reminded me of, I have to be careful how I say this, but it kind of reminded me a little bit of like the dynamic we sometimes see in a movie like In the Mood for Love from Wong Kar-wai.
Oh, yeah.
Which, okay, I want to be careful saying that because I recognize that Wong Kar-wai is a Chinese filmmaker. He's not Korean, so it's a different, it's a different demographic for sure. But just taking his dreamy, emotional choices as a filmmaker and as a storyteller in a movie like In the Mood for Love, I was reminded of that a little bit here in the way that this dynamic between our two leads crystallizes, I'll simply say.
I mean, emotionally, dramatically, the conflict is not too dissimilar.
Yeah.
In the sense that both of those films feature a romance that could happen, but for various reasons won't.
Yeah.
Now, the reasons are very different, but spiritually kind of tackling the same kind of things. Now, I mean, ultimately they're very different films, and Celine Song isn't interested in that hazy, dreamlike aesthetic for sure.
Right.
But yeah, emotionally, dramatically, from a character perspective, at the very least, there are similar-ish things happening there for sure.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's inappropriate. And I guess to how that film crystallizes, I kind of love how this one commits to what it had been establishing from the very beginning. Like, there's no sleight of hand. There's no we're diving into fairy tale or anything that is unexpected.
There's no surprise twist here.
It commits to realism.
No one's a robot.
No time travel, as it
No
turns
time
out.
travel. None of them have the dial of destiny.
Yeah, although I'm sure they wish
Well,
they did
I
have
mean,
that.
well, I guess it's a very different dial of destiny here.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah.
Very, very different dial.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I love that commitment to realism and how this would play out. There's an emotional truth here that I think is very universal.
I agree.
Even if the cultures here are quite different than
Oh, it's a
what
great
many of us
movie.
might expect.
It's a very good movie.
So good. Any final thoughts on Past Lives?
Let's talk about the score. Let's talk about the score.
Great. I do love it.
Christopher Bear, Daniel Rawson, two composers here working together. And I mean, in many ways, it's like, I mean, a great score is going to do a lot of the emotional heavy lifting, right? I mean, that to say that a score is going to do that is not a knock on the movie, because you remove the score from any movie, movie's probably not going to work as well. E.T. doesn't work as well without John Williams. It's
That's very true. Yeah.
So it's almost unfair to say it in a way that suggests it does all the heavy lifting, because it doesn't. But there are many moments where their music ramps up to the point that it started to stimulate an emotional response out of me, even if I didn't always know why.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is in that ending. There's also a moment when it first surfaces, the music itself, in that first act, when we see our two leads playing with each other as kids on their first date. It's in many ways, it's a musical score that's helping to tell the story. It's playing along to the emotions of what's happening on screen. So it's helping to create that trajectory, that emotional trajectory. It's guiding us. It really is. And a great score is supposed to guide us through that. And I think their work does that very well. So it's wonderful. Little things like that. And one thing I want to mention too in my final thoughts, and then I'll toss it back to you to close this out. There are little details I noticed that I found so fascinating and so artful. And I can't wait to watch the film again to pick up on a few more things. So one of my favorites again is in the third act. I think it's that first, it's not really a date, but it's the first meeting between Nora and Hai Sung in New York. And they're just walking around. They're walking around together. I forget which park it is. It might be in Brooklyn or somewhere near Brooklyn. But I know that she talks about living in the East Village and things like that. But do you notice all the people around them? They're all couples. They're all paired off. And I love that little sting of irony there. I found that so interesting. Little details sprinkled throughout the film. It's going to make it a very rewarding one to rewatch. I can't wait to do that.
I will say, and this came to mind to me in the theater, when this comes out on demand, I'll have to see if I can find the clip, because in Multiverse of Madness, in Doctor Strange, there was that clip of the woman at the wedding behind Strange that went viral because she was like really going for it. When they're on the boat going by the Statue of Liberty, this film had that.
Oh my
there
gosh!
Are people posing on that boat, and they are going for it.
I want to watch that again now, just to watch the extras.
If you missed that the first time around, go watch this movie again and just pay attention during that scene. The extras there are going extra, and it is so good.
I love it. The extras are going extra.
They're
love
going
extra.
Yeah. So it's funny how I thought of Doctor Strange when watching this movie.
I mean, I said this earlier in our opening that in some ways this is kind of a multiversal movie.
Yeah,
at least I mean,
kind of is.
I'm not taking ownership in that interpretation. I've heard a couple people say that on Letterboxd, and you like kind of making a point to compare it to this whole multiverse movement of movies we're getting, and this almost fits into it more theoretically,
it does,
and culturally, which I found interesting.
Yeah, no, for sure. It definitely has a little bit of that going here with the 8,000 lives.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I really loved this film. The scores you're talking about, Christopher Bear and Daniel Rawson, I think do such an excellent job. And I love that the score is actually kind of quiet. There's a somberness to it that's really great, but It's not, I think, aching for the heartstrings like a lot of scores that are a little bit, louder. And
Yeah.
again, I'm not saying that as a bad thing because someone like John Williams is the master at that.
Oh yeah, but let's think of it this way: would he have been the right composer for a movie
no,
like this?
he wouldn't have. He definitely wouldn't have. And I love John Williams, the GOAT for sure. But yes, because this is a more internalized film, it's methodical and needed to have a score that reflected that. And I think those guys did an impeccable job.
Agreed.
In that regard. So, I love the film musically. Structurally, as we talked about with these three distinct acts, I think it's interesting. The one thing that we haven't really talked too much about is I love how each act has its own distinct aesthetic as well. Like that first one when they're younger, it has more of like that mid-90s vibe to it. I'm not sure exactly on the years and timeline, but
I think it's the late 90s, given some
90s,
of the technology there.
Yeah, it makes sense.
I mean, I'm just guessing.
And then, that central act has that mid-2000s aesthetic and vibe to it, especially with Skype, like early Skype. And then...
So Celine Song is going for some Danny Boyle, Steve Jobs related energy here. It's
a little bit. So I mean, I feel like each act was a little distinctive aesthetically as well to reflect the passage of time. So I certainly wanted to give her credit for that as well.
Yeah, it's very much
and overall, her filmmaking is great. The editing of this film is especially mesmerizing.
Oh
But
yeah.
the visuals, the way she uses the camera here. I think are really good. Primarily, this comes down to the writing and the performances, though. And some of those little details, one that came to mind as you were talking there was, this is partially why the Statue of Liberty thing came to mind for me, because they have that moment. And when they get back, Arthur asks them, "Where'd you guys go? What'd you do?"
Yeah.
And he says, or Nora says, "We went to the Statue of Liberty," and Arthur's response is, "Well, we've never been there together."
I know.
Just adding to the tension and the conflict there. So, it's like little things like that, because Nora didn't do anything intentionally to hurt anyone. It was just, your friend is in town, you do the touristy things. It makes sense that that's where they would go.
Mm-hmm.
But, her and her husband have just never been there.
Yeah.
Which makes sense to me, because if you come to South Florida and you do a lot of the touristy stuff here, there is a very good chance that Brandy and I have not been. Like we have not touched the touristy Miami stuff here.
Oh,
so.
that's locals have their own spots, right? It's just how it works. Like when I lived in Nashville, I rarely went to Broadway, the main stretch there. That was the touristy spot. I was going to other places. I was going to Germantown or 12th Avenue South. It's just what you do as locals.
Yeah, and exactly. So, and obviously, your day-to-day lives don't dictate that you go to those places anyway.
Right.
Like I'm at home with my children most of the time, and if we're going outside of our little circle here, it's, usually to specific places that demand, or the like for our kids.
Yeah.
So, when that's how Nora and Arthur would be living their lives, they're not going to go visit the Statue of Liberty and do all the traditional New York stuff. They're going out and just being themselves.
Yep.
But it's interesting how that becomes a thing when something like this is brought into the middle of it.
Yeah.
Because otherwise Arthur probably wouldn't care. He certainly wouldn't have thought about it, but it's like, oh, well, now you've been to a place that we haven't been together, but you've been.
Yeah, so now you have a special thing with this guy and not with me.
That's the only reason that matters.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not a big deal, right?
Right.
So,
exactly.
But those little things, could be missed, or it certainly adds up to what we get at the end.
Mm-hmm.
What seems small initially becomes important later.
Yeah.
And it's certainly evidence of a good writer and director. It's striking that this is a directorial debut. And we've said that a couple of times over the last few years. After Sun last year, that blew my mind.
Yeah.
Blew my mind.
Yeah.
And for what that film was, I think this is equally up to the task in many ways. So
yeah, I'd say After Sun, Charlotte Wells, and what she was doing there was it's certainly more technical. There's more flashiness to that.
Yes.
Very different film, mind you. So that's not to say that one was more effective or even more confident than the other, but when we see directorial debuts like this, where we rarely can find what we consider to be a misstep or something overly ambitious, that's what we don't often see, right? That sense of control. It's so easy for a first-time director to trip over their ambitions, which is not a bad thing to see. Sometimes a good first-time director should do that, so that helps them find their respective voice. But to be this crisp and this efficient the first time out, pretty darn awesome. It's
incredible.
Yeah,
it's quite incredible. That is for sure. So, yeah, I do think this is one of the best films of the year so far. I imagine that this will be on a lot of top 10 lists at the end of the year.
We are no contrarians here on this one.
Not on this one.
Yeah.
No. Anyway, with all of that said, be sure to let us know if you agree or disagree with any of our takes. If you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment. You can visit us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, maybe, if it's still active. Who knows?
I don't know what Twitter is, but I hear it's the scariest place on earth right now.
If you're on Blue Sky, we recently joined Blue Sky, so you can find us there at In Session Film as well. Instagram, TikTok, all the usual places. But let us know. I imagine most of you watching, listening to this loved it as well.
Yeah.
But feel free to reach out to us anyway. So anyway, with that said, we also have a review for Indiana Jones, The Dial of Destiny, coming soon. I'm not sure the order on the releases of these reviews, but we also have episode 541 coming out where we do our mid-year report talking about our favorite films of the year so far, so be on the lookout for that as well. Or maybe it's out already. Again, I don't know about the release of any of these episodes.
They'll all be within a couple days, so just
Exactly.
listen to the date that we say up all these episodes, and you'll know what the actual recording order was.
Absolutely. All right, with all of that said, thanks for watching, everybody. Subscribe, hit the like button if you're on YouTube. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We will see you all next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Oh,
Movies.
What a movie. So good. So good.